but I think we should make a start. My name is Anne Field. I'm a volunteer and former trustee of the library. And welcome everybody, both in person and online, to the first of two events this month, marking the 40th anniversary of the miners' strike and dispute in the 1980s. This week, we're talking about the causes of the dispute, the reaction of the mine workers and their families and communities, and the trade union movement, and the political underpinning to both the attack on mine workers and their families and the reaction of workers and their families, including the trade union movement overall. So, two distinguished speakers online. I'd like to introduce, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Heather Wood. This is the second time that I've had the honour of introducing her. First time was earlier this year at the Morning Star conference in London. She was one of the mainstays of the Women Against Pit Closures movement in Easington. She's written a book which was published recently about her activities. She started off as a nurse, but very quickly became involved in the trade union and labour movement. And Heather will be talking about the attacks on workers and their families during the dispute, and the organisation, the civil defence, if you like, that went nationwide in defence of the workers. On my right, but certainly not politically, is John Hendy, who is the most distinguished employment rights lawyer, QC, or now KC, King's Counsel, and member of the House of Lords, at the request, I have to say, of Jeremy Corbyn. And he is there to try to add weight to the fight for workers' rights, but has a long history of being the absolute go-to lawyer fighting for workers' rights and in defence of workers against the onslaught by the state and by the employers. Miners, print workers, bricklayers, building workers, dockers, transport workers, you name it. John has been there representing workers in, on occasion, really knife-edge issues, and remains the go-to person for struggle as opposed to simple, straightforward issues. John will be talking about the history of attacks on workers, as well as the fight for extension of trade union rights and the political underpinnings that led to the attacks on workers, which went out into the open in the 80s. I have to do a little bit of housekeeping, first of all. The Marx Memorial Library, as you may know, is a registered charity committed to its constitutional objectives. Now, in these fraught and febrile times, I'm obliged to make the statement that the library does not support any political party and will not condone any conduct which could prejudice its charitable status. Nevertheless, the sole and exclusive object of the library shall be the advancement of education, learning and knowledge by the provision, acquisition and maintenance of a library. relating to all aspects of the science of Marxism and of the history of socialism and the trade union and working class movements. So the library is busting with material not only about the study of Marxism and Marxism-Leninism, but the struggle of workers worldwide against oppression and restraint by the state, by the military, and by the employers, not only in the UK, but worldwide. And our archives are on every conceivable political and revolutionary and anti-colonial struggle you care to mention, including in this month, or just gone, of the April Revolution in Portugal, the Spanish collection, the anti-nuclear collection established by Professor J.D. Bernal, the print workers collection. There are many, many aspects of political and industrial struggle represented by our collections. And our education work is to expand on that and to go out to the community to offer that information to people. We have classes, we have films, online courses and lectures, all of which you can see on the website. We will be recording this session and putting the lecture, but not the questions and answers, on the website. And I said that this is the first of 2 sessions this month. The second session will be next week, the 15th of May, and that will be on the archiving of struggle, focusing on the miners' strike. You can imagine an archive of a struggle of pretty well a year, plus the lead up to that struggle and the fallout is a huge task. And there will be 3 key professionals speaking of that, including our archivist, Matt Dunn, who is attending this meeting this evening. There is some merchandise, Marx Memorial Library merchandise at the back. So if you've got any particular interest, Matt and Phil will be able to help you. So we're faced at the minute with a Tory government that's clearly in a state of collapse, but not so, as you'd notice, as far as government is concerned, government with a small g. The repression of workers, the poverty levels are still plummeting, and big business continues in its pursuit of repressing workers' rights. And this phase has, as we all know, continued for the last 45 years. The plans were laid to dismantle, restrict initially public services with the IMF loan in 1976, and then in 1979, in the teeth of great anti-worker, anti-union, anti-public service atmosphere, the Tories were elected, committed to repressing and restricting trade union organisation. And within 5 years as well, billions of pounds, 27 billion pounds altogether, had been taken out of local government services within 5 years by the Tory government. So people complaining now about the 60% reduction in local government since the Tories were in power, that is on top of massive reductions in local government services. So at every level, we've had a government, either Tory or Labour, committed to maintaining the power of profit and capitalist ownership and restricting the power and the ability of workers to defend themselves on the one hand and to advance on the other. Now, with the pivotal moment that the miners' strike and dispute represents, it's important to situate that in the battles that had taken place already to try to defend jobs and services, both in education, the steel industry, the water industry, public services, and local government workers had all been in struggle. There were huge battles going on in the education system with the introduction of two-tier employment, where lecturers and teachers were being forced to decide on different contracts. All of the battles that were waged before the miners' strike were a lead up to that pivotal moment. Followed, of course, once the mining industry had had its death blow, followed by the destruction or the attempted destruction of the print unions and the printing industry. Although the mining industry has been all but destroyed, the employers haven't managed to destroy the printing and publishing industry, but it's dramatically reduced and the print unions are still there. But everything that followed on from the miners' strike and from Wapping in 1986 to 7 has become a template for the repression of workers ever since. And John will obviously be describing how those laws and the power of the state have been used to justify the repression of workers at work, in the community, in services, in every aspect of life, whether you're talking about health or education or housing or pensions, public services, refuse, cleaning, every aspect of life has been put at risk by Tory government policy, unabated by Labour Party activity, other than on individual rights. But as we all know, I'm sure in this room and at our guests online, individual rights are totally meaningless without collective protection, whether you're talking about collective protection in services or collective protection of trade unions. And this is what the Tories have been relying on, this whole stress on individual rights. So our first speaker will be Heather. Look forward to your contribution, Heather. And there will be questions, an opportunity for questions, but the discussion will be involving both speakers after John has spoken as well. So questions for Heather initially. Heather, welcome.
Hi, glad to be here. I wish I'd been down there though, but totally support ASLEF in their industrial dispute that they're having for the next few days until they can resolve their pay rise, which is well deserved. It's where to start, because the two opposing factions, you had Margaret Thatcher, who was out to get our communities for what we had done to Heath in 74. But also you had a woman who wanted to grind trade unions down. She felt the trade unions had too much power, too much strength. She wanted to get them. So she decided she would go for what was deemed the strongest trade union and the biggest trade union at that time. And that was the miners. It was, I think everybody here will know, it was nothing to do with coal, nothing at all. I mean, they say now it was to do with the environment. What a joke, what an absolute joke. Then you had us. They were the them, and then there was us. And I don't think we were particularly bothered about coal either, but we were bothered about our communities that had built up over many years from when the pits were first sunk. Communities through the trade union, the NUM, which had built up, to my mind, and I say this everywhere I go, the closest thing to socialism that I would probably ever see in my lifetime. We had before I was born, long before I was born, the NUM, through the members' subscriptions, paid for the first doctor to come into our communities. And that's where you had Nye Bevan formed the NHS, because he had a similar thing in his village in Wales. We had the union paid for recreational facilities. It bought land to provide space for the miners and their families to enjoy what little leisure time they had. We had a community where, and I have to say, it's not looking through rose-coloured glasses, because there were some bad things about our community, but to point out the good things, they were respect for each other, thinking of each other. If anyone was ill, if someone needed help, there was always someone in the village that would help. So you had this spirit of socialism. That's all, for want of another word, that's all I can think. But you had the other side, which was the illnesses and the poor health and the deaths of men working down the mines. So it was really in one way, it was very difficult for us to fight for something that we didn't like. We wanted to keep the mines open, but we wanted jobs. We wanted our community. Easington was fields. It was farmers' fields until the pit was sunk. Pit was sunk, the village came, the houses came, the shops came. We knew what would happen when the pit closed. The village would die, and that is what happened. But in '84, we decided that we would stand up and fight. I have to say, my husband wasn't a miner, but all my ancestors, and my dad was the last miner in our family. He died of emphysema and chronic bronchitis. My grandfather, my father's father, was killed at Shotton Pit just along the road from us, and his stepfather died of pneumoconiosis. So in '84, we knew we had a fight on our hands. One thing I will say about Thatcher is that she was a good plotter and planner and schemer. She had it all weighed up the way she was going to fight us. I don't think we were ready, but I'll tell you what, the women were ready. I said in the early March that we should involve women, because if we had the women out there doing stuff, then the strike would last. If the women were opposed to the strike, the men would be forced to go back to work. Women came out in their hundreds. Their first job they wanted to do was to provide food, to provide sustenance, to fill the bellies of the bairns. And they did that absolutely brilliantly from day one. But then, as they became politicised, they wanted to be out there on picket lines. They wanted to be at rallies. They wanted to speak in public. They went on to write poetry, to write stories. They acted in plays. They toured the country, toured Britain, and some travelled abroad. So the women did so much during the strike. I have to say that the women achieved their goal. They said they would provide food, at least food, for as long as the strike lasted, and they did that. Thatcher did not beat the women. She didn't beat the miners and their families, because most of us are still out there fighting. We lost a battle, but we didn't lose the war. But I think some of the things that need to be remembered from the strike are the police, the way the state was mobilised against communities. Law-abiding citizens were invaded by police. We were the enemy within. A badge I have to say I wear with pride. But you just take August the 24th, 1984, my own village. The night before, Piers Merchant, Tory MP, had been on television saying, why could Durham Constabulary not get one man in at Islington Pit? The next day, our village was invaded by around 2,500 police. And we're only a small village. The roads were taken up with police on horseback, in vans, in cars, on foot. So they took the road and the footpaths. We were not allowed to pass unless we stopped at the police cordon first. We weren't allowed to go in certain areas of our community. Thatcher put the might of the state against us. And then she says that we were the enemy within because we fought back. We were fighting. And we fought for that full year. You had Orgreave. June, I'm trying to think of the date, June the 16th, 1984, when men from all our mining villages turned out on a lovely sunny day, most of them without even a shirt on, not a t-shirt, a pair of shorts and a pair of sand shoes. They went out for a day. They thought they were going out in the sunshine and that was it. But it changed, didn't it? Again, the state. She used the police as an arm of the state. And these are the things we need to be prepared for in the future. We need to remember what happened then, because in my village, people had forgotten that the Tories had used the police against us in the past. We need to remember these things. But Orgreave, men that I saw get on the buses that day, who were laughing and smiling and joking, men that when they came back were different men. Absolutely changed men. Some now, and I always say, there's at least one man comes to my house once a month, and all he wants to talk about is exactly what happened to him on that day at Orgreave, because he can't get it out of his head. There's not a day goes by when he doesn't remember what happened to him that day. And that's happened to hundreds of miners from throughout Britain, ordinary people who just wanted a job. We stuck it out though, we fought, and we're still fighting. I just want us all to be fighting together. I want us all, I keep saying this, the left needs to get over itself, and that's me included. All the factions within the left, it's about time we started saying, look, this is where we want to go. We all agree with where we want to go. But we have to forego some of what we really want to do to get to that goal. We've got to agree to disagree and move on from there. Because if we don't, we've finished. There isn't a Labour Party. There is no Labour Party. If there ever was a socialist Labour Party, the only one that I saw, well, the only one I saw in my lifetime, it wasn't a Labour government, but a Labour Party with a good leader, was Jeremy Corbyn, who brought hundreds, if not thousands, of young people into what was our party, to my mind, a party that I'd belonged to from when I was 17-year-old and only just left last year because I'd seen enough. I'd seen good friends, good comrades, Ken Loach, Jamie Driscoll, to name just two of them, thrown to one side, people who supported the Labour Party almost all of their lives. We on the left have got to unite. The trade unions have got to start working together, and not just the bosses within the trade unions, the people. It's got to come bottom up instead of top down. We've got to get together. Otherwise, communities will die, as ours has. We have nothing in our community now except our memories of what was there and our fight to continue to keep our community together and to fight for a better future for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Heather. It's a moving description and reminds me of when we held the exhibition to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Wapping dispute. We had men as well as women, some who couldn't even bring themselves to come to see the exhibition, and others who just were moved to tears because they still had not got over the trauma of a year-long dispute where they lost everything, their livelihoods and so on. But the miners' struggle, people lost their communities. Heather has so graphically described. Now, has anybody got any questions for Heather before we move on to our next speaker? Any questions? Yes.
Well, it's not a question, it's an observation. I don't know how old Heather is.
Have we got the microphone? Can you?
She's forgotten about Major Attlee and what 1945 achieved, and I'll leave it at that.
Right. Okay. Anyone else? No questions. Heather, what is the position now with the Easington Women Against Pit Closures organisations? And is Women Against Pit Closures still operational, or have women generally gone into other spheres of activity?
No, we are alive and kicking. This year we've already had an enormous rally in Durham of women from all over Britain, as well as from mining women from America, Holland, Germany and France. So that was our first, that was to what we said, kickstart the 40th anniversary. But we have lots of things planned for the future. I'll be announcing them mainly on Saturday at Wakefield Banners Held High. But for a start, we are working with women internationally in the future. We will be, the first thing is, we will be putting together an international women's banner. Women from each of the countries that want to be involved will provide a piece, a square of a quilt. Each country will provide its own, and that will depict what they do in their country. Those squares will all come together into Durham, and they will be sewn into a banner and a quilt. And it's hoped, and it's looking like, that the banner and the quilt will tour the world. That's a start. We are going to have a seminar in Wales later this year of women from wherever they want to come from to discuss ways that we can work to achieve a better world. And it's young women. On the 2nd of March this year, when we had our rally in Durham, it was, what I said was, it was to commemorate what women had done, and not only mining women, but women throughout the centuries, because what women do, they just go out and do it, and then all of a sudden it's swept under the carpet and it's forgotten. And then we wanted to celebrate what women have done in the past. But then the biggest thing for me is the challenge is to inspire younger women to come forward. And thankfully, that's happening. Younger women are joining our cause, and we will be working together for as long as it takes.
I think one of the joys at the minute, amid the awful devastation that's occurring in Gaza, is the number of young people, but young women in particular, on all of the demonstrations. There's clear mobilisation going on, and to hear the shouts and the cries of "We are the people, we will not be silenced." It's just, and that's the spirit really that we should be talking about. I know we're all a bit depressed about the Labour Party and what have you, but we really have got to get a grip of ourselves. Which leads me on to John, really. I was working today on the Print Workers collection, and one of the documents that popped out was legal opinion from my learned friend here to the print unions at the time on pursuing the EETPU for their piracy at Wapping. But John is going to talk about the trade union response and how trade union defence and advance is pivotal to combating the power of the state and extending the power of the people. So welcome, John. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. So just let me begin by justifying why I, as a lawyer, should be talking about the miners' strike. I wanted to explain that during the miners' strike from 84 to 85, I was the junior counsel for the National Union of Mine Workers and for most of the area unions of the NUM, because it still is a federal union consisting of a union in each area. And during the strike, as I'll mention very briefly in a minute, legal action was brought against the NUM and against the area unions to prevent picketing, and in particular to try and cut off funding for the strikers and for the pickets and for the miners' families as well. And that was the significance of the civil litigation. I wasn't concerned at all with the criminal prosecutions, of which there were many, which we can mention later. But before I start, I should just mention great pleasure to me that two of my legal colleagues are in the audience this evening. Jeff Shears, who was the former chief executive of Thompson Solicitors, and Steve Cottingham, who at the time was a solicitor in Seaford Sedleys, who were the lead solicitors for the NUM. So I've got to be very careful about what I say this evening. I want to talk about the significance of the miners' strike, and in order to do that, I want to touch on the origins of the strike. Heather's mentioned some of them, but I'd like to enlarge that a little. You probably remember the famous Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai, who said, when asked in the 1970s for his thoughts on the significance of the French Revolution in 1789, he said it was too early to judge. Well, it may be too early for us to judge the significance of the miners' strike 40 years later, but let's have a go if we can. Beyond the privilege and the appreciation of hearing from Heather and those who are most intimately involved, the mine workers and their families, in that heroic struggle, there are other matters to consider. I don't want to go back to the origins of history, although I'd absolutely love to do that. But I just want to mention a little bit of history before we get to more topical matters. During the 19th and the 20th century, or by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, by the end of the First World War at any rate, trade unions, from being completely illegal criminal conspiracies, had become lawful organisations, and strikes and picketing were capable of being conducted lawfully, the law would permit that, and collective bargaining, particularly collective bargaining on a sectoral basis across each industry, had become the policy of all governments up until the election of Thatcher in 1979. Those principles were crucial elements in the so-called post-war consensus in the United Kingdom, established after the Second World War. Hence, a member of the audience mentioned Clement Attlee's government of 1945. But it was the same across Europe as well. It was a modest mitigation of 19th century capitalism, which aspired to nationalisation of the commanding heights of the economy, progressive taxation, the provision of a health service, education, municipal housing, and a welfare state, as well as the lawful operation of trade unions and the tools that they had at their disposal to defend the working class. But the end of the Second World War also coincided with the foundation of a particular school of economic thought, neoliberalism, which was dedicated to the overthrow of that post-war consensus. The names of Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman are well known. We haven't got time to expand on their free market doctrine, except in one particular respect, and that is the proposition that trade unions are tolerable except to the extent that through collective bargaining they distort the so-called labour market. These philosophers considered that the price of labour should instead be left to the freedom of individuals to compete with each other, to work for the lowest wage necessary to sustain life. Well, we haven't got time to contemplate either the extraordinary success of that doctrine, which was put into effect, first of all, by Pinochet in Chile in 1973, by Thatcher in 1979 in the UK, and by Ronald Reagan a year later in the United States. But that was the doctrine that guided these leaders of neoliberalism. The 1970s are actually highly significant. In the United Kingdom, it was the most equal decade in our history, both in terms of wealth and of income. The share of national income taken by the top 0.1% of the population has never been lower than it was in 1978. The share of gross domestic product going to wages rather than profits has never been greater than it was in 1976. Thatcher's government was determined to reverse all that and to create a neoliberal economy designed to increase profits and the power of corporations. Several elements are evident in what she was up to: deregulation, deindustrialisation by allowing heavy industry and manufacturing to close in the UK and transfer to cheap labour economies, privatisation of state assets, outsourcing, destroying community cohesion by deregulating housing and selling off council stock, culture wars, and so on. We can't explore it all, but one thing is of particular relevance, and that was the plan to break trade unionism and collective bargaining, a plan to disempower workers and restore the managerial prerogative, regulation of trade unions and deregulation of corporations. That Tory plan was some years in the making, as Heather has intimated. There had been a failed dress rehearsal with the Industrial Relations Act of 1971, which was beaten by working class power and the shop stewards movement. But Thatcher's team was emotional about the need to take revenge for the failure of the 1971 Act and the threat of a general strike to free the 5 Pentonville dockers in 1972. They were, as Heather said, angered by the success of the miners' strike in 1972, with the triumph of the blockade of Saltley Gate by local trade unionists supporting the miners. Tory emotion shows in the vengeful prosecution and conviction of the Shrewsbury pickets in the same year, not vindicated until the 23rd of March 2021, when the Court of Appeal finally found them all innocent. The Tories were even more incensed by the miners' strike of 1974, on which Ted Heath staked and lost the general election. Part of this strategy was to emasculate trade unions by legislation, this time slice by slice, thus avoiding hopefully the showdown that followed the 1971 Act. Another part was the total exclusion of trade unions from policy formation. Yet another was the monstering of trade unions and trade unionists by the supportive right-wing media, as Anne has mentioned. Globalisation, outsourcing, privatisation all played their parts in disempowering trade unions. But there was one tactic of prime relevance for our discussion today, and that is the breaking of a union in a major set-piece engineered strike. We can see the origin of that in the so-called Ridley Report of the 30th of June, 1977. Remember that? 7 years before the miners' strike. It set out the need and methods to privatise the national industries, but it also contained a confidential annex. And this annex elaborated the plan to break the unions. It considered several unions the government might want to take on, but it said, quote, the government should, if possible, choose the field of battle, unquote. It concluded, quote, the most likely area is coal, unquote. And to that end, it proposed a number of things. Coal stocks should be built up at power stations. Plans should be made to import coal from non-union foreign ports. Non-union lorry drivers should be recruited by haulage companies. Power stations should be adapted for dual coal oil firing. Benefits to strikers should be cut off to make the union finance them. And a large mobile squad of police should be equipped and ready to uphold the law against the likes of the Saltley Coke Works mob. That was a quotation. That plan was followed by a report on the 14th of November, the same year, 1977, called Stepping Stones, which outlined the propaganda war which was to be fought against the unions. Well, in February 1981, the government announced plans to close 23 pits across the country, but the threat of a national strike was enough to force it to back down. Nonetheless, by the colliery review procedure, which had been agreed with the NUM, closures proceeded on a case-by-case basis, and the workforce was reduced by 41,000 between March 1981 and March 1984. But such an orderly rundown was not going to achieve the Ridley Plan. That plan was put into effect. Ian McGregor was appointed in 1983 from British Steel, where he'd wreaked devastation on the British steel industry. Coal stocks were built up, though the NUM saw what was coming and instituted an overtime ban in November 1983, but it wasn't sufficient to counter stockpiling. On the 5th of March, confrontation was triggered. The NCB announced that 5 pits would be subject to accelerated closure in just 5 weeks. Corton Wood and Bullcliffe Wood in Yorkshire, Harrington in County Durham, Snowdown in Kent and Polmaze in Scotland. Miners at those pits walked out. On the 6th of March, the next day, the NCB announced that the pit closure agreement, the colliery review procedure, was obsolete, and that 20 collieries would close with a loss of 20,000 jobs. That was plainly designed to force a wider strike. The suggestion that one reads about, that Arthur Scargill, the president of the NUM, stupidly chose springtime to call a coal strike, is absurd. The timing was engineered by the state. Arthur, in fact, received a leak from a NCB insider, a brown envelope received at Sheffield headquarters. I was actually present at the day. I remember that envelope being received. We don't know who it came from, but when Arthur opened it, it disclosed that the NCB plan was to close more than 70 pits. Nevertheless, McGregor wrote to when Arthur put that on the television, McGregor then wrote to every NUM member claiming that Scargill was deceiving them and there were no plans to close any more pits than those that had already been announced. Cabinet papers released in 2014 showed that McGregor's plan was, in fact, to close 75 pits over a 3-year period. Now, the tactics that the Coal Board used were obviously brute strength. One of the tactics was to tie the union up in litigation. That's where I came in. I don't want to spend the evening talking about the endless cases that we took. I spent a year and a half doing nothing but civil litigation on behalf of the mining unions. The Coal Board, in fact, launched a legal action against the NUM, obtained an injunction against the strike, and then decided that enforcement of it would only solidify the strike. So it dropped it. But what they then did, with the support of the Thatcher government, was to organise and fund actions by working miners against the NUM and its areas. And it was that litigation that I was engaged in fighting. Now, in question and answer, we can discuss the subsequent injunctions, contempt of court proceedings, sequestration and receivership of the assets of the unions. Likewise, we can discuss the police and criminal proceedings, 10,000 arrests of mine workers, the police riot at Orgreave that Heather's already mentioned, the overrunning of pit villages that she described at Easington, but many other pit villages as well by the police, roadblocks in Kent preventing Kent miners going to up the motorway to the northern coalfields, cutting off of Nottinghamshire, surrounded by a ring of steel. Nobody could drive in and out without police permission. And the dirty tricks, the surveillance, lawyers. I know my phone was tapped. Every lawyer's phone was tapped. Every office, a little lawyer's office was tapped, as well, of course, as the offices of the mine workers. We know that the chief executive of the NUM turns out to have been an agent working for the security services. And if I got just one moment to digress, and there's a famous photograph, which I'm sure you'll remember. I should have brought a copy of a woman taking a photograph and a police officer on horseback, raising his truncheon, ready to strike her. I represented that woman because we were going to bring an action for the legal tort of battery, which is threatening somebody with violence. And we had the original negatives of that. And at this time, before electronic photographs and so on, in order to prove a photograph in a court of law, you had to produce the original negative. Now, the solicitor instructing me, not one of my colleagues at the back, small firm, a chap who'd actually worked for, been in the army, military type, but absolutely straight up and honest. He had that roll of film, kept it in the safe. There was a burglary at that firm the day before we were going to go to court. What did they take? They didn't take the laptops, the computers, the telephones, the cash in the top drawer of the office. They took that roll of film. Nothing but that roll of film. So, dirty tricks. Somebody mentioned before to me that the executive of the NUM used to meet in London to negotiate with the coal board. When they came down, they stayed usually at the county hotel at the top of Tavistock Place, and they ate in the North Sea fish restaurant in Lee Street, known very well to my colleagues at the back there. That North Sea fish restaurant was considered by the Yorkshire miners the best fish and chips outside Yorkshire. Its significance is that that fish restaurant was bugged by the security services, who put bugs in the walls in order that they could catch any conversation between the members of the miners' executive before they met the coal board. And then after the dispute was over, we had all the business with the Lightman report, which you may remember. They planted or tried to allege that Arthur Scargill had made off with £500,000 worth of Russian mine workers' money, an absolute outrage. So the miners, in short, took on the entire might of the British state. And one of the ironies about this dispute is that had the coal industry still been in private hands, it's quite clear that the solidarity of the mine workers and the women against pit closures and the support groups would have won. It was only because this was a state-owned and controlled enterprise that the government was prepared to sacrifice the entire coal industry, even the energy industry, in order to win this dispute. And with it, they hope to destroy trade unionism. The point I want to make now and to finish on is that notwithstanding the heroic resistance of the miners, their unions, the women against pit closures, the miners' support groups, and the working class as a whole, who did support the miners, the NUM was in fact defeated, just as the neoliberals had planned, and we have been paying the price ever since. I won't speak this evening about the things that Anne mentioned in opening, the destruction of the health service, the education service, housing, transport, and all other public services. But let's just mention wages. Wages today are stagnant. The real value of average wages has not increased since May 2007. The median wage, according to the ONS, for last month is £29,000 a year before tax. Now, median is got a special meaning for statisticians. It means that half the working population earn less than £20,000 a year. And of course, amongst that cohort, that group of people in the lower half are in particular women, the disabled, funnily enough, self-employed workers, and in particular, of course, part-time workers. Poverty is now rising. Only this morning on the Today programme, it was reported that the number of children in temporary accommodation, in short, homeless children but living with their families, has risen from 120,000 to 140,000 in the course of only 1 year last year. 14.4 million people live in poverty. 3.8 million people live in destitution. There are more people on benefit in work than people on benefit out of work. And collective bargaining coverage, just as the Thatcher government planned it, has fallen from over 80% of the population, working population, covered by a negotiated agreement between the ending of the Second World War and 1980, over 80%, 8 out of every 10 workers having the benefit of a negotiated agreement, to less than 25% today. This is all the consequence of neoliberalism, and in particular, the destruction of the power of trade unions, exemplified by the defeat of the miners. However, we can take heart, fortified by the example of the recent upsurge in strikes in so many industries, and the heroic campaigns by climate activists, renters, surfers against sewage, the disabled, and so many other campaigns, both national and local, and of course the mobilisation of working class people against the genocide in Gaza. We must, as Heather says, do our best to form a popular front to combine trade unions, local trades councils, and all these campaigns together to confront capitalism and uphold the dignity and rights of all. Thanks for listening.